The radio was a revolutionary technology that harnessed radio waves to broadcast news and entertainment to everyone in the United States. Much of modern media has been influenced by the radio, especially the cell phone. During the golden age of the radio, specifically the 1930s, radio became the leading form of media, both domestically and internationally. Unlike ever before, people had almost instantaneous access to information from the outside world. The radio revolutionized how people accessed breaking news, entertainment, advertisements, and music. As wonderfully useful as the radio was, and still is, the government utilized broadcasts to propagate wartime propaganda by intermixing the hidden messages with entertaining stories and news reports. The propaganda was intended to sway the public throughout World War II. The Radio Corporation of America optimized the radio to create the largest broadcast network ever, the National Broadcasting Company. NBC delivered radio programming to the nation by creating networks of affiliated stations. NBC had over 40 stations across the U.S., all of them connected by telephone wires leased by AT&T. Radio was funded by commercial sponsors that would discreetly add in sales pitches. Over time, those sales pitches became more frequent and catchy throughout the broadcasting. Radio technology before 1927 was chaotic and unmediated until its institutionalization by the Federal Radio Commission. The FRC was in charge of regulating the radio broadcast industry, licensing radio stations, allocating the frequencies to each station, and controlling the power usage of each station. FRC is the predecessor of the current Federal Communications Commission. On November 2nd, 1920, KDKA, a Pittsburgh radio station, broadcasted the Harding-Cox presidential election results. The broadcast created a countrywide obsession with radio, and that obsession spawned 556 stations by 1923. Every institution and corporation turned to radio broadcasting for advertising and general news announcements. That includes banks, department stores, colleges, towns, cities, etc. Radio technology truly became a part of everyday life for citizens. The public was so impressed with what they would hear that they did not care what the content was. They would pretty much listen to anything. The onset of public broadcasting was a general mix of education, news, culture, sports, entertainment, and music. Radio announcers became celebrity personalities that people from the U.S. and international nations felt a personal connection with. The radio reached almost everyone, and the country became unified in its speech, moral values, customs, and cultural tastes. The radio made the country more cohesive than ever before. Radio also made a massive impact on how politicians went about campaigning for their political careers. After the Harding-Cox election, politicians looked to radio appearances for a significant portion of their campaigning strategy to reach most of the people within their target audience. The average American had unprecedented access to the political world, and people were actually able to hear directly from government officials. They were able to hear speeches, debates, etc., instead of having it be transcribed and altered by newspapers. Franklin Roosevelt utilized radio fireside chats to circumvent policy-opposing newspapers and speak directly to citizens. He discussed the economic crisis of the Great Depression and banking to generate public understanding and support. These chats made him more personable and popular to the everyday individual. The Great Depression spread throughout the United States like wildfire. People were hungry, unemployed, and the future of the nation's economy was bleak. The radio provided a necessary escape and kept the country united in one of its hardest tribulations. During the Great Depression, the radio stimulated the economy when the entire country was economically bereft. Advertisements brought money to the radio networks and frequently inserted clever announcements throughout the broadcast to encourage people to buy various convenience goods. The radio changed society from that of conservation to consumption. Another marketing ploy utilized in radio advertisements directed advertisements to particular consumers. For example, women were generally relegated to the position of housewives and homemakers. Radio advertisements would feature specific consumables that would be beneficial to the average woman. Due to women being home all day, they would have access to the radio more often than anyone else. So they had more exposure to entertainment stories or soap operas that would span the length of weeks. Soap opera characters would lend their voices to celebrity endorsements, or the product would be featured in a soap opera episode. The radio was completely dominated by advertising disguised as entertainment, and this concept was transitioned to wartime propaganda during World War II. World War I had Americans wary of war and wartime propaganda, but the radio industry helped the government infiltrate radio to influence the public's opinion of the war. Propaganda must be painless. That was the motto for the radio network allocation plan, which was created by CBS, NBC, the radio division of OFF, the National Association of Broadcasters, and the Office of War Information. Implementing the plan was voluntary, a concerted effort by the radio industry to help the war effort. But the plan was also not necessarily voluntary. If a broadcast was not following suit, they would be pressured into compliance. The plan was an open secret, known by everyone in the radio industry, but not generally known by the public. The plan served two purposes: to help the wartime effort and to keep the government from saturating the radio waves with dull, uninteresting messages that would disturb the listeners' engagement and enjoyment of the broadcast. OWI radio officials, broadcasters, and advertisers made radio a successful wartime propaganda system by not disrupting the broadcasting schedule and American citizens' listening habits. Radio was meant to be entertainment, and it remains so to be able to access as many people as possible during World War II. OWI would draft up various topics that they wanted the programs to discuss, and they would leave it to the content writers to integrate those messages into the regular programming. A message could address the American people to make them comfortable and knowledgeable about a new war organization, inform them about rationing measures, reinforce the necessity of general sacrifices, or request funding donations. Comedic skits were the greatest beneficial vanguards to delivering these wartime messages. The comedic relief would be relaxing and distracting, while the content's undertones simultaneously influenced the public's opinion of the war. The overarching wartime message was generally subtle but direct in its approach. Many citizens were unhappy and dissatisfied with the war and its effects on the nation, but radio programs created characters that the average American citizen could relate to, including people who had issues with the war. The anti-war characters would be portrayed as selfish or naive, and the other characters, influential and reputable people within a community, would shoot that down and negate the anti-war concerns. The messages generally told people to lighten up and put their petty concerns and problems with the war aside. One's self-interest needed to be put into a new perspective. The needs of the country and the war took precedence over everything else. More serious content also made it into the radio under the guise of entertainment. After World War II and television's eventual invention and saturation of the public, the radio's high rise amongst society started to fall into obscurity. Critics revolted against the commercialization of the radio because it generally became synonymous with advertisements and consumerism. Those opposed claimed that commercialized radio degraded culture, brainwashed homemakers, and was filled with false advertising. The mass monopolies of radio were dissolved into other companies, or they moved on to other mediums. The medium's luster has disappeared, at first bowled over by television and now almost completely eradicated or transformed because of the internet. Radio has since moved to the internet for most of its content or apps for phones like iHeartRadio or SiriusXM. We also, of course, hear it in our cars on our daily commutes. But it is really not as golden as it once was during the 1930s to the 1940s.